Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Paul Krause, editor-in-chief of Voegelin View. He's a writer, podcaster, and the author of Finding Arcadia, Wisdom, Truth, and Love in the Classics, published by Academica Press in 2023, and The Odyssey of Love, a Christian Guide to the Great Books, published by Wittgenstock in 2021. Educated at Baldwin Wallace University, Yale, and University of Buckingham, Paul is a frequent writer on the arts, classics, literature, religion, and politics for numerous newspapers, magazines, and journals. And you can follow him on Twitter at Paul J. Krause. Paul, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Hi, Josh. It's nice to be with you. This has been, I think, like several years in the making.
I think so. I was thinking about that, actually, when I sent these questions over. But I'm pretty sure this goes back to, I want to say, probably 6 years ago, when I was a very devoted reader of The Imaginative Conservative. I'm more sporadic in reading that one these days. And you published an article there on Gulliver's Travels that I used the first time I taught Gulliver's Travels. And then I know we corresponded a bit on an article for Voegelin View, and I'm pretty sure I still owe you at least one, maybe two book reviews. So but it's the first time we've actually seen each other, even in the digital format. So it's quite nice to get together.
Yes, it is.
Well, Paul, before we get into Gulliver, tell us a bit about your journey. I'm really curious what brought you to love literature. How did you end up as editor-in-chief at Voegelin View? And anything else you want to tell us? Help us know you a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's always good to get to know people a little bit more. Funny, you mentioned this, bring this up about introducing yourself, So obviously, as an editor, I get a lot of emails, submissions especially, where, I'm addressed as either Mr. or some people even think that I have a PhD, although that is nowhere specified in my bio. So I get introduced, they call me Dr. Krause, but I'm always like, just call me Paul. I prefer the personableness of first names. So it's quite interesting because after Yale and then after studying with Roger Scruton at the University of Buckingham, I kind of reinvented myself as a literary critic. So my actual degrees are in economics, history, and philosophy. That was my BA. Then over at Yale, I took a degree in biblical and religious studies. At that time, I wanted a PhD in late antiquity. My background in philosophy and ancient and Islamic history from an undergrad would do well for late antiquity, but I was missing this very important major cultural and religious pillar from 200 to 800, and that was obviously the Bible and Christianity. So I was like, well, I just need to go to a really great school, get a degree, a master's, so that would bolster my PhD application. Eventually, I decided I did not want a PhD, ventured over to England to study with Roger Scruton, who I had greatly admired as an undergraduate. One of my professors even used his book on modern philosophy to teach the early modern period. But my love of literature goes back to when I was young. My father especially instilled a love of literature and stories. He was the one who used to tell us stories growing up as a kid to my younger brother and I, especially at night at bed. So hopefully somebody has always been reading you bedtime stories. That's often where the love of stories and literature can begin. I was actually an honors and AP English student all throughout high school. And I suppose the one reason why I still love literature is because I didn't have the misfortune of being an English major in university.
That I kind of want to poke at that last bit a little bit, but maybe after two quick comments, I think you're the second Roger Scruton student that I'll have interviewed then. I don't suppose you know a guy named Daniel Pitt.
Kind of. We're mutuals on Twitter.
Okay.
I correspond with him sometimes. I'm aware. Yeah, he's a student as well. He seems like a great guy.
He really is. I met him at Action U last summer. Great guy. He came on the show and dropped his episode back in season 5. And then I just did an episode that will come out in season 6 with a Hungarian scholar, Ferenc Sforcher, and who's wrote a book on Sir Roger. So there's a so Roger Scruton is sort of apparently an unintended running theme through my recent interviews, which is quite fun. And on bedtime stories, I don't know that I remember my parents reading me bedtime stories as much as telling me bedtime stories. I know my dad would make up what he called computer stories. He always made them up on the spot, but they always opened with, this was back in the 1990s. We had an old MS-DOS, very basic computer. And the stories would always involve us somehow getting sucked into the computer, having fantastic adventures, and then somehow getting out of the computer. Usually, my brothers and I were all asleep by the time before we could actually get out of the computer. And maybe that has something to do with my lifelong obsession with science fiction. I don't know. But say a little bit more about that last bit. Why do you think it was very fortunate that you did not do an undergraduate degree in English? Why would an undergraduate degree in English actually corrode your love of stories?
Well, it's my experience with a lot of English majors. I had some friends as undergrads who were English majors, and they ended up just really hating literature after their 4 or 5 years studying. Obviously, as an editor-in-chief who has largely reinvented Voegelin View, moved it away from... So one thing about that, I love Eric Voegelin, very important. I was networked into the Eric Voegelin Society when I was at Yale. My philosophy background predominantly concentrated in political philosophy. So obviously Voegelin is a very important figure in political philosophy. But that philosophical background was something that peaked later in life. When I was a senior in high school, we had some philosophy classes. But so in reinventing the journal to do a lot with art, culture, literature, stories, the things that move my heart in particular, I'm often dealing with people who are recent graduates of English programs, and they're like, they think it's amazing that they can finally like freely write about stories instead of, to put it nicely, I am not as opposed to so-called deconstruction and critical theory as some people might think. I think there are a lot of wonderful things and important takeaways and insights that one can gain from it. But it's my experience with a lot of English majors that, for instance, deconstruction, critical theory, and especially Marxist analysis, and also certain racial analyses of literature tend to predominate now at the university level. So instead of getting an education in enchantment and love, say, of Shakespeare, you're being indoctrinated to why Shakespeare is a misogynist and a sexist and a racist. And of course, that's going to destroy your love of the arts and of literature. That's obviously not universally true, but I do find it to be somewhat on point at a lot of, say, state schools and even some of our more prestigious universities.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I'm currently teaching a studies in the novel class, and this morning we started Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and which technically I think is a short story, but I didn't realize that when I put it on the syllabus, so we're still reading it. And it's my first time reading this one, and I did find myself reaching for a bit more of a race-based analysis, because I think it's clearly in the text there. Conrad's doing a lot with the contrast between white European colonialists and black bodies that are clearly treated a certain way as black bodies. But I think there's something different about coming to that sort of analysis after years of deep training and learning to love the subject that you're reading versus starting with those sorts of analyses. Like there can be something kind of poisonous if you start there and don't fall in love with literature first.
Yeah, because as you're just saying from your own experience, one of the problems with that is that becomes your only window into literature. And the irony about that is, of course, you're being told that it's going to liberate you in your interpretation. But everybody I've ever met that's their 4, 5, or 8 years of literary training, that's the only window that they have. They're incapable of having any other perspective on literature. And I actually find that to be quite tragic because, as I mentioned, and as you were implying, I do think there are some important things that you can take away from literary deconstruction and certain aspects of critical theory. But then that's just part of a larger toolbox that you have to interpret literature and storytelling.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's well. On that note, we should definitely get into Gulliver's Travels because we can do a whole other conversation on critical theory and the right way to do critical theory. But I really want to get to Gulliver's Travels. So it's just so much fun. So walk us through kind of your reading of Gulliver's Travels. What do you think this complicated 4-part novel, if it's a singular novel, if it's a fictional travel log, or whether it's like 4 separate stories that all build, whatever you take it to be, how do you read this convoluted book?
Well, that's the $1,000,000 question, right? How do we interpret and how do we understand Gulliver's Travels? Because like many people and perhaps many of your viewers, my first encounter with Gulliver's Travels was, I believe it was like a Disney cartoon from like the 1940s or something like that, where it's just Gulliver in Lilliput. And so it's this funny story of a big guy getting tied down by little midget people. And, it's kind of slapstick and funny. And then I think in the 2000s, there was a Jack Black remake put into contemporary times. My first time reading Gulliver's Travels was as an undergraduate. And I was reading Gulliver's Travels, so I had already started to acquire a philosophical education. And we were being presented with Gulliver's Travels, and we were using an online lecture from Harvey Mansfield, the political philosopher at Harvard, who I think is retiring or has just recently retired, kind of guiding us through reading Gulliver's Travels as a work of philosophy and as a work of political philosophy. And as I had mentioned earlier, there are insights you can take away from employing deconstruction and certain aspects of critical theory. And so I started doing that in reading the text of Gulliver's Travels. This is clearly more than just some children's story, because Gulliver, Jonathan Swift, who is writing it, he's not writing this for 7 and 8-year-olds, the 1720s. We may have been introduced to it at 7 or 8 because of cartoon stories and, funny animation and comedy. But so that's clearly not what's going on here. And then once you start picking up on the language and the movement of the story from Lilliput and Blefuscu down to Houyhnhnm, I would argue you do in fact see this thread of Swift as a cultural critic, Swift as a philosophical critic, and Swift as a student, an analyst of humanity, really trying to understand with his own contemporary time and context, what would it mean for humanity and what would it mean for society if we actually listen to the people who are telling us this is how we should be living, and then we end up in the hell that is Houyhnhnm.
Well, Houyhnhnm certainly is, I don't know that I quite would call it hell, but it certainly is a pretty awful place. Can you walk us through, I'm tracking with your argument. I don't quite see how it's deconstruction, and maybe that just maybe you're using the term different than I expect. I'm thinking, I know deconstruction through Jacques Derrida and sort of the idea of erasure, but I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at, because what you just said seems to me to be very present in the text. I don't need to deconstruct the text to get to that argument. So where do you see your argument of that kind of downward trend of Gulliver and the movement there? Where do you see that being tied to the ideas of deconstruction?
Well, what you were saying with Derrida, obviously as a philosophy student, that's where I was introduced to Derrida and the ideas of deconstruction and erasure. But I would say, you said you had read my essay at the Imaginative Conservative with it. So there are multifaceted layers to deconstruction. And I would say one of the more moderate forms of deconstruction is unwinding and, we'll use the term, erasing a cultural inheritance of the story, right? How many people know Gulliver's Travels mostly as this kind of funny children's story? It's not particularly deep. Or simply read it, as you mentioned, sort of just as a work of mock travel literature, right? Mm-hmm. And so a more moderate form of deconstruction and going deeper into the text and erasing sort of cultural inheritances and how that shape our understanding of it. I would say that's what I was doing, and that's what I was taught also with Harvey Mansfield, in sort of understanding the text, not at just this base level, but actually trying to peer into it, go deeper, see it beyond the surface level, and also just become aware of the limitations of cultural receptivity of how we would interpret the text. I love the cartoon story. I think Disney made it in the 1940s. It actually has a very wonderful reinterpretation and a different adaptation, because there's a love triangle between the prince and a princess of Lilliput that Gulliver has to help out there. So there is that sort of charming side to it. But you were asking, right? Do we read this as just a 4-part story, 4 independent stories, right? So an element here of understanding it as this sequence of decline, because, of course, that is a great theme that English intellectuals are beginning to adopt in the 18th century. Most famous, of course, is going to be Edward Gibbon's narrative history, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published over 6 volumes. But this idea of decline was already apparent in 100 years earlier in the Puritan era, leading to the English Civil Wars. So there's this entire cultural milieu and intellectual tradition of both satire and decline that Swift is situating himself in. And, this is at a point in time when Swift has made the change. Politically, he used to be a Whig in the early 1700s, but now he had come out and he's basically a member of the Tory party. Many of the Tories are in exile. They have been chased out of England by the Whig government. So people who want to say, oh yeah, this beautiful, wonderful Whig England, you just don't have an understanding of English history. The Whigs were very totalitarian people in the 1700s. When they regained power, they chased all the Tories out of the country. They were conjuring up charges of treason, which of course is what happens to Mr. Gulliver, right, at Lilliput. You helped us out so much, you won a war, and now we're going to charge you with treason and everything like that. So I would say there's also a lot of historical context that Swift is kind of poking fun at too here. But I would be adamant, as a number of other scholars are, who would analyze Swift's narrative as a narrative of decline and philosophical criticism, that instead of just reading it as independent stories or mock travel literature, this is in fact a comprehensive and systematic attempt by Swift to kind of understand where English society is, where it's going, and what that would mean for it if it continues down this path.
I think that's helpful, because there's a sense in which, like, most people I know who use the term deconstructed are talking about trying to get behind the text. They want to see some almost invisible layer. But I don't think that's quite what you're doing. You're sort of deconstructing the cultural apparatus around it. Maybe somewhat in a similar way, I think this is a fair analogy, that I taught a fairy tales class last semester, and part of what we did in part was start with trying to try to, as much as possible, approach older fairy tales without thinking about their Disney analogs. Because if we can read Brothers Grimm, if we can read Giambattista Basil without thinking about the 1940s Disney Sleeping Beauty or 50s Disney Sleeping Beauty movie, we can see a deeper story, and it's richer than the Disney version. So I think that's really helpful, and I buy you won me over with your analysis. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me in the text, and I suspect we can kind of get some more examples of that as we talk. I want to go back to the fact that probably most folks listening to this are familiar with the first part of Gulliver. They remember, I mean, even the frontispiece on the edition I'm looking at has Big Gulliver pinned down by little people. Though I will note, none of the pictures of Gulliver I've ever seen ever depict Gulliver peeing on the beach. I think that is just the funniest scene. And when they literally describe having to move his poop, like it's just that wheelbarrow, it's just the funniest thing. That does not make the front of the book. But those are, everybody knows the initial Big Gulliver and Little People Land. But run us through some of the other parts of this book. What are some of the best moments you think that people really miss in this novel because they stop at part one if they read any of it?
Yeah, well, I think it's important that we do enter part one, where Gulliver is in Lilliput, and he ends up involving himself in their essentially dispute that turns to war with Blefuscu. And of course, this is a satire on the rivalry between England and France. Swift is a man who has lived so much of his life in the backdrop of war, right? So famously, Swift had to flee Dublin, Ireland during the Williamite Wars at the tail end of a great propaganda term, which is called the Glorious Revolution. But what was the Glorious Revolution really? Well, it was an invasion from a Dutch prince who was invited in by English parliamentarians to overthrow the rightful king of England. Of course, the winners got to dictate how we were going to understand that event, so it becomes this glorious revolution. But Swift has to leave Dublin as a result of the conflicts in Ireland. So when he arrives in England proper and he ends up in London, then he's going to be privy to this giant war over the succession to the throne of Spain. Louis XIV, the King of France at the time, who we remember as the Sun King, was trying to claim the throne, and if he had claimed it successfully, the entire Spanish Empire would have come under the control of the French. The Habsburg dynasty, which is perhaps most famous for being in Austria, had a member of its family on the throne. They had been ruling Spain, and the last member of that family dies out. So they're claiming that they should have another member of their family on the throne, and this gets into a giant geopolitical struggle over the balance of power, and then England gets involved, as it does, because it doesn't want France to become too powerful. And Swift thinks that I've lived my entire life saturated in war. Wouldn't it be great to kind of have peace? So Swift is actually a man who desires peace. And in talking about Lilliput and Blefuscu, he's basically pointing out here that so many of the European rivalries are over the silliest and the most trite realities. If you've read the story, right, how does the war between Lilliput and Blefuscu happen? It's because they're arguing over which side of an egg you should crack in order to have breakfast. So that's Swift's way of kind of saying, isn't it kind of silly that hundreds of thousands of Europeans are dying over something as silly as which son from some family that we don't even know should sit on the throne, becoming the equivalent of, you should crack the egg on the left side. No, you should crack the egg on the right side. So the first part is Swift dealing with the contemporary political realities of Europe. Lilliput is an example of England, and Blefuscu, obviously by the name, it kind of harkens to the French language, is France. But then we move forward into his second part of the story, which is a very fascinating one as well, Brobdingnag. Some people might be familiar with that one too. There are some famous paintings of the inverse image that we're familiar with of Big Gulliver tied down by little people. You see little Gulliver being analyzed by big people, Brobdingnag. And so the Brobdingnagians, as Swift writes, or through the voice of Gulliver, In the second part, he famously says that what they are explaining to me is perfectly agreeable to the modern philosophers of Europe, which is one of those instances, one of the few sentences that is like a dead giveaway of what Swift is kind of doing here. So this is Swift placing Gulliver under the scrutinies of the so-called scientific revolution that is occurring in the 1700s. Because, right, the Brobdingnagians are looking at Gulliver through scientific instruments, and they're seeing all of these flaws in him, and they call him a freak of nature. And this is very important because we need to understand who Jonathan Swift was. We might remember him as this great satirist and writer, but he was also a member of the clergy. He was a reverend in the Church of England. He belonged to what was basically becoming the High Church Anglican tradition at that time. And Swift approaches anthropology, the understanding of human nature, what it means to be human, from a Christian perspective, right? You are made in the image of God, so you have a certain inherent dignity and beauty to you. But if you're only looking at human beings from the lens of scientific scrutiny, well, of course you're going to conclude that you're a freak of nature and that there's nothing special about you. And that's the conclusion the Brobdingnagians reach with Gulliver as they look at him through the lenses of scientific inquiry and scrutiny in part 2. But it's important that we also remember that Gulliver, when he is in Brobdingnag, is still treated with a certain respect. Harvey Mansfield says this is because Swift is a proponent of ancient Ciceronian ideals, namely the philosophy of duty, that we do have duties and obligations to one another, even if to strangers and people we do not know, which is, of course, who Gulliver is to the Brobdingnagians. So even though they're describing him as a freak of nature, they're still treating him fairly well. They give him a place to sleep. He, of course, doesn't exactly fit in it, and his life is endangered many times because people forget, oh, yeah, he's sleeping on the bed. I might accidentally crush him if I get on it. And there are these giant technological and scientific instruments that, oh, yeah, if you're like a tiny mouse, of course it's going to be dangerous to you. But here, then, we can already see that narrative of decline where Gulliver, even though he is treated with a certain modicum of respect and dignity, is still being called a freak of nature. And the Brobdingnagians, you have this sense of, they don't really like him that much because, you know, he is ugly and a freak. It's fine. It's appropriate to treat him well. You know, they give him food and a blanket and everything like that. But you can already see the slow decline occurring because in Lilliput, even though he's this tall, big man, the Lilliputians look upon him with a certain sense of awe and reverence, right? That's the sort of early, or one might say the Christian perspective on things. Even though you would look at something and be like, that's not like us, there's still a certain sense that you're approaching it with awe, majesty, and wonder. And then once you get into scientific scrutiny, oh, he's ugly, he's deformed, he's a freak of nature. Yeah, we should still give him some bread and some blankets, but, you know, this idea that he's a majestic creature is gone. And that leads us then into the eventual arrival at Laputa, the flying city in the sky, which is Swift's way of continuing this narrative of scientific domination. Because who are the Laputans? Beyond being a satire of the Royal Society in England, which is fairly apparent once you start reading it, Laputa really is the culmination now of the early scientific outlook and the industry that the Brobdingnagians have. We have this miraculous floating city in the sky. The Laputans, their only form of knowledge as they're explaining their city to Gulliver is science and math. Nothing else matters. To the extent that they care about music, which they do, it's only because music is mathematically based, that there is a certain arithmetic to understanding music. So the Laputans represent now the death of the humanities, the very death of humanity itself. Gulliver's there and he's describing them and he's like, well, they're cross-eyed, they don't look right, they're just obsessed with looking at their telescope into the sky, and they don't even do so with any sense of awe and wonder. Again, that issue of awe and wonder. They're just, we need to measure the stars, measure the universe. So it all has just a practical effect. But what's very unique about Swift's analysis of what a hyper-scientific society is like is the Lilliputians need slaves in order to just accomplish their basic common sense tasks because they lack common sense now. Swift is saying through Gulliver's travels in Laputa that a hyper-scientific society actually is a society that has completely lost touch with common sense and reality. And it might make an imbecile like Richard Dawkins very upset to hear that, but I think that's actually true. I mean, when you listen to a number of the great proponents of the scientific ideology in our world today, they definitely don't know how to interact with people. They are often cruel, callous. If there's any sense of awe and wonder in people, they scoff at that and dismiss it as primitive, unenlightened, even though for most of us, especially those of us who are engaged in the teaching of the humanities, we would say, we need enchantment, we need awe, we need wonder. That's exactly what we're trying to accomplish here. We're really trying to achieve an education in enchantment, awe, and wonder. It's not that science and math is by any means bad, but you should never embrace that worldview at the expense of art, at the expense of literature, at the expense of the humanities. And so it's quite interesting when you read part 3 with Laputa that Swift is dealing with this hyper-scientific society that has completely lost basis with reality. They lack common sense. They afford no dignity to people. And of course, the city of Laputa is tyrannical. They use the power of their technology to oppress people beneath them. And one might say, isn't that what hyper-scientific, industrial, and scientific societies in the modern age do? Are we actually using science to benefit an understanding of the universe? Or do we simply use it to oppress people? Do we use it to destroy people? Do we get sucked into it, and basically become its slave? Which you can argue is exactly what Swift is describing in Laputa. The Laputans are slaves to their own scientific instruments, while the Brobdingnagians still had a sense of freedom of word, freedom of being outside. The Laputans don't have that. As Gulliver's famously describing the Laputans, the men especially are just glued to their telescope 24/7. That's all they care about. They have no time for play. They have no time for anything else. They don't even have time to care for their wife and their children, so that gets pawned off to other people. Swift is kind of commenting, isn't it kind of funny that they're not even aware what's going on in their own domestic households? So you can see now Swift continuing this narrative of decline, which is actually a narrative of scientific progress, right? So the proponents of science and progress are saying, this is progressive, this is enlightened. Yet Swift is taking us back and he's saying, is it really? Gulliver almost died dozens of times in the land of Brobdingnag, and now he's in the land of Laputa, where nobody cares for him. He's isolated and lonely. Even though he's getting a tour of the library and the scientific facilities, you get this understanding that, his guides don't care for him. This is just them showing off their technological and scientific prowess. And then, of course, you see how they use that science and technology to oppress people. And then, of course, we arrive now at Houyhnhnm, which is Swift's satire of what you would become if you embrace the hyper-rational, hyper-stoic philosophy. So it's important that we understand some things here in the historical context of what we mean by hyper-rationalism and hyper-stoicism. So a philosopher by the name of Spinoza was a great revivalist of this idea that reason is the only thing that matters. Passion is bad. Love is bad. So when Gulliver arrives at Houyhnhnm, he introduces himself to these horse people as a great lover of humanity. So we are introduced to Gulliver as a representative of, for lack of a better word, traditional humanity, right? He's a man of passion. He loves his country. And as he says, I would count myself as among the first and finest patriots of my homeland. So there's this idea that we get then of Gulliver is a man of passion. He's a man of love, and he's a man of a certain sense of duty and patriotism to his homeland. So the Houyhnhnm, who are horses, this is Gulliver poking fun at the Stoics and the new rationalists, because what animal do we think is very passionate and is filled with spirit, right? It's a horse. Yet that's not what the horses of Houyhnhnm are like. That's Swift's way of telling us that human beings are also passionate animals, passionate creatures. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that is, again, Swift's inclusion very subtly of the long tradition of the classical understanding, the classical Christian understanding of what it meant to be made in the image of God. He's drawing on St. Augustine. St. Augustine famously described the image of God in man as our ability to know and our ability to love. So reason and love are the same. They are equal within the Imago Dei. And this is the reception of the Christian tradition that Swift belongs to. And so now he's meeting the proponents of just man, the rational animal, which is the Houyhnhnm. And then when you get to know the Houyhnhnm and you learn about how they organize their society, it's actually horrific. There's no families. Breeding is done by eugenics. And the Yahoos, who are the humanoid creatures who actually look like humans on Houyhnhnm, they are regarded as creatures needing to be exterminated because they lack rationality. And so it's quite interesting that Swift here is piecing everything together, that if we really follow the scientific ideology to its logical conclusion, you arrive at eugenics and the extermination of people that you would regard as inferior and irrational. And I would argue that the history of the 20th century proves Swift correct, that the people who were advocates of that worldview, they did precisely that.
And there's so much going on in this book. I mean, it's everything you just narrated, Paul. It reiterates how much I regret when people tell me they've only read the first part. Like, they've missed so much going on here. I just want to add two things to what you were describing, and then we'll move on to a different question. But I do want our listeners, I hope that they go out and they either pick up Gulliver's Travels off their shelves or they go buy a copy. Don't watch the Jack Black movie because, again, only going to be from part one. Go get the real book. But there is everything you were describing is 100% is there. What's also there is this book is really funny. It's just like,
it's hilarious.
I think Gulliver Swift really, through Gulliver, he nails, some of my favorite parts were when Gulliver is, at one point he's talking to the Prince of Brobdingnag, and he's attempting to, he's trying to represent his homeland in the best possible light. And he thinks he's described English economics and in trade, And it's so funny when the Prince of Brobdingnag, who does have a pretty realistic view of how things really work, is like, but this and this and this, there's no way that would ever work. Y'all can't be that dumb. And each of those is just a satirical dart thrown at the contemporary way of life. It's really funny. And you alluded to this, but I just want to spell this out. That moment in Laputa, when like literally it's the math, these math guys. Swift literally says, so long as they have a math problem to solve, their wives can literally cheat on their husbands with the lover on the couch, and their husbands won't notice because they've got a math problem to solve. I mean, it's just ridiculous. There's also, over the course of as Gulliver, I find we usually start and end each book with Gulliver at home with his family. Gulliver as the family man is just awful. He's always leaving, but by the end of it, it just kind of breaks my heart that he's so lost touch with reality that he thinks he starts to think like a Houyhnhnm, and he's lost sense of who he is and what's real and how it all works. And Swift just does that in a fascinating way.
Yes, I'm glad you brought this up because I figured you might. If not, I was going to talk about it. So here's another way of understanding what's going on. Is not only is Gulliver's Travel this sort of satirical take on what the triumph of what we would call scientism would look like, it is also a narrative of the unreality of life from the perspective of a family and how a family is destroyed over the course of this movement from start to finish. Because again, as you said, it ends with Gulliver coming back and returning to his family. By the time he returns again at the end of his visit with Houyhnhnm, who had, by the way, been calling him a Yahoo because that's what he looks like, and he's like, he's weeping to a horse, don't call me that. This is awful. I want to be like you. I don't want to go back to my country. And so when it gets back to his country, you would expect, oh, this is such a wonderful moment. My wife and children that I haven't seen, that presumed me dead, they're running to hug me. And how does Gulliver react to that? He shoves them away. He's like, get off of me, you disgusting Yahoos. I want nothing to do with you.
He says they smell bad.
Yeah. And so this is Swift's way of pointing out that the triumph of this super rationalistic scientific ideology is the destruction of the family. Mm-hmm. And it's this revulsion towards love. Because what do we like to see in so many, you were mentioning talking about fairy stories. I love fairy stories. How do so many of the fairy stories end? Either in marriage or somebody who's been away with their family or a loved one, they're reunited, right? There's always this moment of embrace. And yet at the end of Gulliver's Travel, the embrace is rejected. It's cut off. And then you have him in the barn with the horses that he bought because he thinks they're Houyhnhnm, and he's literally neighing with them during supper time. He'd rather be with them than with his wife and children. And I would argue that this is Swift's very insightful yet subtle way of articulating what the ideologues of modern science now tell us. We are nothing more than just an animal. There's nothing special about humanity, right? This is what Yuval Harari says about humans, right? There's nothing special about us. We have organs and muscles and fibers, just like any other animal. There's nothing unique about being human. And if that's so, then what is really preventing us from just buying a bunch of horses like Gulliver and spending the rest of our life with them in a barn?
In part, the maybe this is just speaking to the craft that Swift has at his disposal, but the fact that Gulliver is wrong about so much is inescapable by the end of book 4, because he's wrong about himself. He's not a Houyhnhnm. He's wrong about the Yahoos. They're not nearly as bestial as he treats them as. He's wrong about these horses back in England. They're not Houyhnhnm, and when he's neighing with them, they're not talking back to him like the rational Houyhnhnm. he's wrong about his family and he's wrong about himself. And really that just puts it back to like, so if your thesis is correct, and that's really what's going on here, I think part of what Swift wants us to see is he's not arguing propositionally, he's arguing through a poetic image, and that poetic image just resonates. Like, we recognize Gulliver has cut himself off from what is good by running away from his family and hiding with these horses, and it's really just a sad ending.
It is, but again, there's so much richness, complexity, and insight into what's going on. Because for many of us living today, when we start to connect the dots, we're like, man, that actually sounds a lot like our society. Swift wrote this book 300 years ago.
He had a deep, deep insight into human nature, which I think is, and you mentioned earlier, he was a minister, he was a pastor, a priest. I mean, God gives all kinds of gifts to all kinds of different people, and I don't know that there are many ministers who are called to a ministry of satire, but Jonathan Swift certainly was.
Yeah, and he was arguably the best at it too.
Well, let me ask you about that too. That was on my list. I was thinking today about other satirists from the tradition, and since you called yourself a literary critic, let me ask you to play that role for a second. Where would you stack Swift in the tradition of Western literature as a satirist? I'm thinking of, you've got Aristophanes and Lysistrata with the great sex strike of Athens to end the war. You've got Apuleius and the Golden Ass. You've got Moliere and Tartuffe. Is Swift up there with those? Is he greater than one? Is he lower than them? Where would you rank him as a satirist in the tradition?
Yeah, well, again, this is one of those fascinating questions, because at one level you might be asking, well, do I have an objective ranking? I might disappoint you and disappoint your audience by saying, I'm actually not a big proponent of this, what I would call the myth of so-called objectivity, because I think one of the important things about literature is you develop your own sense of love and appreciation for certain authors. I really love Jonathan Swift. I think he's great. I'm also a big fan of Aristophanes. But when you compare him to Apuleius and others, in so many ways, each satirist is also a prisoner of their time. But what makes Swift so great is not only is he a man of his time, he is a man that transcends it as well. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the problems with reading Aristophanes is his writings perhaps seem so foreign to us because we're not Greek. We don't really know what ancient Athens was like. I would strongly recommend people to read Aristophanes. I love Aristophanes. I think he's hilarious and funny as well. But a lot of his humor might be lost on people who are familiar with Greek history, with the Greek gods, with the Greek tradition. And so you're just kind of reading him and you're like, did I understand his jokes? Where of course, as you're saying, when you're teaching Swift and Gulliver's Travels, it's hilarious throughout. It's very easy to understand. You get it. But at the same time, you really have Swift going beyond his simple cultural and historical context. That's what I mean when he transcended it. Yeah, you can make the argument that maybe the other satirists are also transcending their time and that they have relevant stuff to discuss about metaphysics and human nature. But that is so clearly the case when you read Swift. So on that personal level, I do. I think Swift is one of the great satirists. I always love going back and reading Swift. He's someone you should read every couple of years. You should maybe read him every year, but if you don't want to read him every year, every couple of years is great. Because he's also got other great satirical works like A Tale of a Tub, and even his poetry. We often forget that Swift was a poet. He wrote poetry, And even his poetry is satirical and funny. And they often play on these same themes that we've been discussing about Gulliver's Travels. He writes poems on love and marriage, and they don't exactly end the way you think they would, because, again, they're running away, the lovers become animals, they're not actually forming a family, they just want to have sex and drink at the bar, the equivalent of the English bars for the 1700s. And of course, it's funny when he describes it, because he's like, yeah, they're at the boar's head. It's like a dead giveaway. It's like they're in the animal kingdom now, and that's what they want. And so, not only is Swift just really funny as a satirist, he's also deeply perceptive and insightful. In so many ways, the entire corpus of Swift's writings, from Gulliver's Travels to Tale of a Tub to his discussions of, eating children to solve the hunger crisis, to his poetry, it's not just to make you laugh. He's actually exposing the hollowness of the so-called rational philosophies of his time, of saying, like, what is really preventing you from doing these things that you say we should be doing, if you're going to follow it to their logical conclusion?
I think that's really his greatest strength. I love how you pointed out that his height comes when he hits those universal pieces. I think you've done a great job illustrating for us the value of really tracking down the details of some of his satirical images. We can get a lot of insight into particular moments in English history, but honestly, you can still read his work without doing that. You can read this as a book without the footnotes or the endnotes, and you can still, and Swift writes in a way that's universal enough that he transcends his moment. And I agree with you about particularly about Aristophanes and Apuleius. I would like to think Moliere is a bit more closer to Swift, but that may just be good.
Moliere is great too. If you have audience members and listeners who haven't read him, he's a great read as well.
And if anybody wants one more recommendation for reading, if you're going to read Tartuffe by Moliere, you want to find Richard Wilbur's translation. It is so good, much better than all the other stuff. Well, Paul, as we're wrapping up to come to the end of our conversation today, I wonder if you could take us to the end of Jonathan Swift's life and the accusations that people make about him and misanthropy. Or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that word correctly. You may have to help my pronunciation a second, but he was accused of being a hater of mankind by the end of his days. And I've read varying accounts of how exactly his end of days went. Some folks say he was insane. Others say he was that was a false accusation. How do you understand his end of days? And do you think he actually hated mankind by the time he died?
Well, see, now this is one of those most enduring and fascinating questions about Jonathan Swift, because in so many ways there might be an irony in, did Jonathan Swift die having become Gulliver, the very character that he was actually trying to caution people not to become? I actually think he did die a misanthrope, a hater of humanity. There's a famous story because again, he was, as a minister, he has this struggle of, he needs to be kind and compassionate to people, but yet he sees all their flaws because they're coming to him. It's like, I cheated on my spouse. I've murdered my husband. My child has run away and joined the Royal Navy. And good riddance, I don't even want him back, and everything like that. And he sees English society continuing to deteriorate down the trajectory that he was kind of warning against in the early 1700s. George Orwell, famously, another great English writer. In some sense, you can argue that Orwell was a satirist too. He has a famous essay, I forget what it's titled, but one of his essays, he's dealing with Swift, talking about how Swift ended his days as a hater of humanity. So that's certainly within the received tradition of understanding how he died. I would tend to agree, but I think it's really, he ended up there as a tragic figure then, because he simply was beaten down and broken by all the problems that he saw, all the issues and the myriad problems that he was actually trying to help resolve through his life. And then it was just like, it's getting worse, it's getting worse, and it's getting worse. And so perhaps by the end of his life, he kind of lost hope. And this is where he should have learned better, if we could say that, of the great dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral. He should have learned a little bit better from his mentor and teacher, St. Augustine, that hope is the greatest of virtues that you can have, because it is hope that prevents you from falling into despair. Because as Augustine points out in The City of God, once you lose hope and you end up in despair, there's nothing left from preventing you to fall into hatred. And when you fall into hatred, you end up being unable to see all the good and the beautiful things around you. And of course, I think you've mentioned that you're a teacher, and I'm sure your audience is aware of your work as a teacher. Like, one of the things that you're engaged in as a teacher, I would hopefully, is you're really trying to educate in hope and enchantment and in wonder, so that people can in fact see the good and the beautiful in the world we exist in. Because it's so easy to just fall into that pit of despair. But if you do, I hope you don't buy horses and start neighing with them, thinking that you're having a conversation with them.
Oh, that's fantastic. I would definitely fully affirm the goal of students walking out of my classroom reminded of the importance of hope, enchantment, and wonder. This actually came into the close of my dissertation, because I wrote 260-something pages about C.S. Lewis and gender, and then come around to the conclusion to realize the answer to the problem of transgender is really not science. It's not that we don't know that unnecessary surgery is bad for us and unnecessary hormonal treatments are bad for us. We know that. We don't really need someone to say that, and other people have already said that. What we need is a rediscovery, a re-enchantment of our minds to properly understand all of reality as a gift, and our right response as a response of gratitude for the beauty of the gift. And I think C.S. Lewis is one of the best people to do that. But I thought of that as you were talking about the hope, enchantment, and wonder. I think that's really what I want all of my students to come away with. And really, in that sense, I think Swift is a little bit of a cautionary tale, because if he had such great insight. I feel that way about a lot of the greats who ended up in such awful, they die badly. I mean, I really hope I don't ever achieve some utter greatness, because it might come with some horrific cost attached. I mean, I don't want to be Aeneas who leaves Dido and then has to go marry some awful person the gods have decreed, and then go build a city that I don't live to see. I'd much rather stay in Carthage and be happy and have a smaller life. But that hope, enchantment, and wonder, I think, is so key. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been really fun. Do tell us real quick, where can people find and follow your work online?
Well, as you said, I'm the editor-in-chief of Voegelin View. So if you were to find Voegelin View, you could find my author profile. I do a lot of writings there. There are some various other places that I write. I do have a newspaper column with a Christian newspaper. I get to write on art and literature. I can't complain. Unfortunately, that's kind of like just a print newspaper, so there isn't much to access that online, But I think it's wonderful that I just get every month 1,000 words to just talk about whatever I want. You can find me on Twitter, as you mentioned. My books are available on Amazon. I have another book coming out in the summer. I think you'll like it. So, Josh, I'll have to make sure you get an author copy. I'll sign it for you too. So,
oh, please do. Please do.
If I end up finding greatness, you could sell it for $1. I won't be upset with that. But yeah, if people want to find out more about my writings, I do tend to post a lot of my writings on Twitter for anybody who's interested. And if you were to just look me up on Amazon, you would find a number of my books there, all talking about how love and wonder is essential to the literary life.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for joining us today. And thank you, listeners, for being here for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Paul Krause, editor-in-chief at Voegelin View and author of Finding Arcadia, Wisdom, Truth, and Love in the Classics, along with The Odyssey of Love, a Christian guide to the great books. If you like this episode, please do leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful.